She knelt on the cold tile, the electric razor buzzing in her trembling hand, when the door creaked open, and his voice caught in his throat. "What are you doing?" he asked, but in that moment he already knew, and he would never forget it. The smell of burnt toast hung in the air like guilt. Clarice wiped her hands on the apron she'd been wearing since dawn, the third batch of breakfast this week that she'd messed up. She hadn't even realized she'd been crying again until she saw the streak of salt water dripping onto the kitchen tile. She was early, earlier than usual, not because anyone asked her to be. In fact, no one really noticed when she arrived. That was fine. She liked it that way. Being invisible gave her space to breathe, to feel, without the burden of explanation. The mansion was always quiet in the mornings, except for the hum of machines, coffee makers, security systems, distant televisions no one really watched. Clarice moved like muscle memory through it. 6 bedrooms, 4 bathrooms, a kitchen that could feed a wedding party. She had all the keys, but none of the invitation. She paused outside the little girl's door. The air there always felt different, still, like the house itself held its breath. Inside, Emily lay curled on her side, tiny fingers wrapped around a stuffed giraffe whose neck had gone limp from too much love. The chemo had taken her hair quickly, faster than they'd expected. Clarice had swept strands of blonde from the pillow again and again, pretending not to notice Emily watching her with those big, knowing eyes. Clarice remembered her own child's eyes. She blinked hard. She turned away. She had cleaning to do. On the other side of the house, Damien Aldridge stared at a spreadsheet without really seeing it. His home office was lined with accolades, photos with governors, gold-framed charity awards, architectural designs named after him. Power radiated from every surface, but lately it all felt like ash in his hands. His daughter's hospital bills could be paid in full for 10 lifetimes, and still he'd never felt so helpless. He had stopped going to the hospital months ago. Something about the smell, the sterile, suffocating smell, made him want to peel his own skin off. That, and the look Emily gave him sometimes. Not angry, just tired. Tired of his apologies, tired of his absence. He funded cancer research. He bought the best doctors. But he didn't know how to sit still beside a hospital bed. He hated himself for that. "Mr. Aldridge," came the voice through the intercom. It was Bernard, his assistant. "You've got a 2 p.m. with the Japan team, then the AI prototype reveal at 4. Do you want to send flowers to the charity gala? You declined again." Damien clicked the button. "Yes and no, handle it." He leaned back in his chair and rubbed his temples. Somewhere beneath him, in the far-off part of the house he rarely entered, Clarice was cleaning, cooking, breathing life into a home that had become a hollow shell. He'd barely spoken to her, just a nod in the mornings, a quiet thank you when dinner appeared on the table. She was good with Emily, though, better than he was. That used to make him jealous. Now it just made him ache. Clarice was in the laundry room when she heard the soft knock. Emily stood there in her slippers, wrapped in a dinosaur blanket. "Can I help you today?" she asked, her voice thin but certain. Clarice turned, surprised. "Baby, it's okay, you rest." Emily shook her head. "I want to feel useful." Clarice smiled. "Then you already are." They folded towels together, slowly, in silence. Then Emily looked up. "Does it hurt, losing your hair?" Clarice froze for a second. Her fingers clenched the towel tighter. "I think," she said slowly, "it only hurts when people act like it should." Emily nodded, like she understood more than a child ever should. "I wish I didn't look like a sick person," she whispered. Clarice didn't answer. She reached out and touched Emily's cheek, just briefly. Later that evening, after Emily had gone to nap, Clarice stood in front of the bathroom mirror with a pair of clippers in her hand. She had never done this before. The sound startled her at first. The vibration tickled her skin. But as the first lock of her dark hair fell into the sink, something unexpected happened. She exhaled and kept going. Each pass of the clippers felt like shedding a layer of sorrow. It wasn't about pity. It wasn't about making a statement. It was about Emily. It was about showing that beauty wasn't in hair or health or how softly people talked around you. It was in choice. She didn't hear the door creak open. She didn't realize someone was behind her until she saw his reflection in the mirror. Damien Aldridge. He stood frozen. The man whose eyes hadn't held emotion in months looked like he'd just seen the world break open. "What are you doing?" he asked, voice barely above a whisper. Clarice didn't flinch. She met his gaze in the mirror. "For her," she said. He didn't respond. But something shifted. In his eyes. In the silence between them. And for the first time since this house had known illness, there was a flicker of warmth. Damien didn't move. He stood in the doorway like someone who had just walked in on something sacred, something he wasn't meant to witness, but couldn't look away from. Clarice didn't rush to explain. She held the buzzing clippers in one hand, her eyes fixed on his in the mirror. A few locks of her thick black hair still clung stubbornly to her scalp, the rest littering the sink like soft shadows. Her breathing was steady, though her hands trembled slightly, whether from nerves or grief. Even she couldn't tell. "For her," she repeated, quieter this time. Damien swallowed hard. "You mean Emily?" Clarice nodded. "I don't understand." "You don't have to," she said gently. "It's not for you to understand." There was no malice in her voice, just truth. Soft, unwavering truth, and that cut deeper than any rebuke. Damien stepped forward slowly, like approaching a wild animal you're afraid to startle. His eyes, always so sharp and calculated in boardrooms, looked human. "She asked me if it hurt," Clarice said, voice thin now, cracking in the middle. "Losing her hair." He looked down at the floor. She shouldn't have to ask questions like that. Clarice finally turned to face him fully. Her half-shaved head exposed her scalp like a fresh wound. "But she does," she said, "and she's braver than either of us." The silence sat thick between them, charged with too much truth to untangle in a moment. Damien looked away. He had spent months shutting the world out, avoiding things he didn't know how to fix. He built walls made of productivity, of logic and money and distractions. But now, watching the woman who cleaned his house and cared for his daughter without fanfare stand before him vulnerable and unashamed, those walls cracked. "What made you do this?" he asked, almost afraid of the answer. Clarice tilted her head, the buzz of the clippers finally gone still in her hand. "She needed someone to look at her," she whispered, "and not see a patient, just see her." Damien's throat tightened. "I haven't been able to do that," he admitted. "No," Clarice said softly. "You haven't." He should have felt angry at the bluntness, but he didn't. He felt exposed. She turned back to the mirror and gently pressed her hand against her bald scalp. It was still foreign, still surreal, but somehow it felt like the truest version of herself she'd ever shown in that house. "I had a son," she said suddenly quietly, 12 years old when he passed. Sickle cell. Damien's breath hitched. He used to hate when I fussed over his looks. Always said hair was just decoration. She smiled faintly. I never believed him. Until now. He stared at her. "I'm sorry," he said, and for once it wasn't performative. It came from somewhere real. "I know," she said. There was a long pause. Then Damien stepped forward, close enough now to see the tiny goosebumps on her arms, the red rim in her eyes. "I can't fix anything," he said. "Not for her. Not for you." Clarice looked at him. "No," she said again. "But you can try." The next morning, Emily squealed when she saw Clarice. She reached out and ran her fingers gently over the smooth scalp. "You did it," she said, breathless. "You really did it." Clarice grinned. "We match now." Emily hugged her tighter than she ever had. "Now I'm not the only alien in the house." They both laughed. From behind the hallway corner, Damien watched them. He hadn't told Emily what he saw. He didn't need to. It wasn't his story to explain. But something inside him softened, like ice melting just enough to let water trickle through. That evening, he joined them at dinner for the first time in weeks. He even brought Emily's favorite dessert. Damien didn't speak to her the next morning, not in anger, not in coldness even. But something unspoken had settled between them overnight, like smoke from a fire that had burned too bright, too fast. Clarice felt it in the way he avoided the kitchen, the way his footsteps, usually precise and deliberate, now hovered in doorways and vanished before he was seen. She didn't regret shaving her head, but she regretted being seen. She wasn't supposed to matter. Not like that. Not in his world. She had acted on instinct, on love, on memory, but now part of her wondered if she'd overstepped, if maybe she'd made him feel pity rather than connection. That was never the goal. He was her employer. She was the help. There were lines people like her weren't supposed to cross. That afternoon, Clarice stood folding laundry again when Emily appeared in the doorway. She wore a beanie today, one with tiny yellow ducks, but her eyes were bright, lively. "Daddy didn't go to work today," Emily said. Clarice looked up. "No?" "He stayed home. He just walked around a lot and stared at the pool." Clarice smiled faintly. "He's thinking." "About what?" Clarice hesitated. "Maybe about what matters." Emily crawled up onto the dryer and swung her legs. "Do you think he's scared?" Clarice paused. "Yes," she said. "I think he's very scared." Emily nodded like it made perfect sense. "I think he forgets how to be a person sometimes," she whispered. Clarice looked at the child, this fragile, fierce little thing who carried more wisdom than adults 3 times her age, and she felt her throat tighten. "He's trying," Clarice said, her voice soft, "even when it doesn't look like it." Meanwhile, in his home office, Damien stared at a drawer he hadn't opened in months. It held photos, family ones, of a woman with wind-blown hair and soft brown eyes, Emily's mother, his late wife. Her death had come suddenly, an aneurysm, nothing to prepare for, no long goodbye like Emily was getting now. That was the sick irony of it all. He hadn't had time to grieve his wife before his daughter was diagnosed. Now every emotion felt like a betrayal. He didn't know how to mourn one person while trying to save another. He finally opened the drawer. The photo on top showed Emily, age 5, on her mother's shoulders, her hair flying wild, her smile uncontained. Damien closed his eyes and let himself feel, just for a second. Then came a knock. He wiped his face before answering. Clarice stood there, her hands nervously folded in front of her apron. "Sorry to bother you," she said. I wanted to make sure everything's all right." He studied her. She looked different, not because of the shaved head, but because of how she carried it. With quiet dignity, like she had nothing to prove, only truth to offer. "It's fine," he said. "You didn't do anything wrong." She nodded. "I know." He blinked. That wasn't the answer he expected. He thought she'd backpedal, offer some apologetic platitude. But she stood her ground, kind and firm. "I didn't do it for approval," she added. "I did it because she needed to see someone choose her, without fear, without hesitation." His throat closed up again. "You don't have to explain," he said. Clarice's eyes didn't flinch. "I'm not explaining. I'm telling you what love looks like." That struck him like a slap wrapped in silk. She turned to leave. "Wait," he said suddenly. She stopped. He looked like he wanted to say more, but the words got stuck somewhere behind his ribs. "Thank you," he said finally, "for being braver than me." Clarice nodded once and disappeared down the hallway. That night, Damien sat on the edge of Emily's bed. Her breathing was light, rhythmic, her small chest rising and falling under the duck-printed comforter. "Daddy?" she mumbled, half asleep. "Yeah, sweetheart." "You saw Miss Clarice's hair?" He smiled. "I did." "She's cool," Emily said dreamily. "Yeah," he whispered. "She really is." He watched her for a while. Then he made a decision. The next morning, Clarice arrived to find the dining room table set. Not by her. Fresh waffles, strawberries, whipped cream, a mug that said "Number 1 Dad," mismatched and clearly stolen from Emily's tea set. Damien stood behind the stove wearing an apron over his designer shirt, looking completely out of place. Clarice raised a brow. "Is this—" He cleared his throat. "My turn." She smiled, faintly amused. "Didn't take you for the syrup and waffle type. Desperate times." Emily peeked out from the hallway and giggled. It wasn't a grand gesture, but it was real. That was the spark. 2 days later, Emily fainted in the garden. She had only been outside for 10 minutes, picking sunflowers and humming quietly to herself, but her body had become fragile like tissue paper in rain. Clarice was the first to reach her. She caught her just before her small frame hit the stone path. Damien was on a call when he heard the scream. He dropped everything, literally. The phone shattered as it hit the tile. When he burst into the garden, Clarice was cradling Emily in her arms like she weighed nothing, tears streaking her cheeks, but her voice calm, soothing, measured. "It's okay, baby. I've got you. I've got you." "Get the car," she barked at him, eyes sharp with command. And for once he obeyed without hesitation. The emergency room was a blur of bright lights and tight waiting chairs. Emily was stable. They said it was exhaustion and low blood sugar. Normal for her condition, but still terrifying to witness. Damien sat hunched in a stiff hospital chair, head in his hands. Clarice sat beside him, upright, silent. "I should have been with her," he muttered. "I should have watched her." Clarice didn't argue. She simply laid a hand gently on his shoulder. The touch startled him more than he expected. He wasn't used to being comforted, especially not by someone like her. "She asked me for ice cream before she went out," he said bitterly. "I told her to wait." Clarice turned to him. "You were scared." "That's not a crime," he scoffed. "It's not parenting either." "She forgives you every day, Damien," Clarice said. "The question is, can you forgive yourself?" He turned toward her slowly, her name in his ears for the first time. "Damien." Not Mr. Aldridge. Not Sir. Just Damien. It did something to him. Undid something in him. He looked down at her shaved head, at the strong lines of her face, the weariness in her eyes that mirrored his own. He saw her now, not as a maid, not as help, but as a woman, a mother, a soul who had borne more than her share of grief, and she chose to love anyway. Emily was admitted for observation, a private room, of course. Damien's money could buy the best, but it couldn't make the hours pass any faster. Clarice refused to leave the hospital. "I'm staying with her tonight," she said without flinching. "She'll have nurses," Damien said, unsure why her decision made him feel disappointed. "She'll still wake up afraid," Clarice replied, "and she needs to see someone who chose to be there." Damien hesitated. "Then I'll stay too." Clarice looked at him, surprised. "You don't have to do that." "I know," he said, "but I want to." And that changed everything. The couch in the hospital room was laughably small for a man of Damien's size, but he made it work. Clarice sat in the reclining chair beside Emily's bed. They watched her sleep as the IV dripped rhythmically into her tiny arm. There was something raw and beautiful about the silence between them now, not empty, just understood. "You know," Clarice said softly, breaking it, "my son used to hate hospitals." Damien turned his head. "What was his name?" "Jalen." She hadn't said it out loud in years. Not like this. He had this little Spider-Man blanket he took everywhere, even when the nurses teased him, said real boys didn't need blankies. And what did he say to that? Clarice smiled. "He said real boys don't care what other people think." Damien chuckled. "You talk about him like he's still around." "He is," she said. "Everywhere I let love lead me. He's there." Damien stared at her, stunned by the simplicity of her strength. "I wish I'd met him." "He would have loved Emily," she said. "He would have fought for her." They sat in quiet reverence after that. At 2:47 a.m., Emily stirred. "Daddy," she mumbled. Damien was beside her in an instant. "I'm here." She blinked. "I had a dream." "Yeah?" "You and Miss Clarice were both bald," she giggled. Clarice laughed softly. "Guess I started a trend." Emily reached out her tiny hand. one to each of them. They took it. And in that moment, no job title, no illness, no class or wealth or grief mattered. Only hands, only warmth, only love. The next morning, a nurse walked in to see three heads leaned together in sleep, a man who built empires, a woman who held broken pieces with grace, and a child who had stitched them together. No one said it aloud. But something had changed. They were no longer just a sick girl, her employer's maid, and her emotionally distant father. They were something else now, something beginning. A week passed. Emily was back home, weaker than before, but brighter somehow too. The hospital scare had stirred something deep in all of them. Damien now sat with her every evening, reading aloud even when she'd already fallen asleep. Clarice still cooked, cleaned, folded, but Damien noticed she moved slower now, more tired, more distant. One evening, after Emily drifted off mid-sentence during Charlotte's Web, Damien found Clarice in the laundry room, quietly staring at the spinning dryer. "Everything okay?" he asked. She nodded too quickly. "Clarice," he said gently, "you can tell me if it's not." She turned to face him then, and her eyes were damp. "I went to visit Jalen's grave this morning," she said. Damien blinked. "I didn't know you still went." "Every Sunday, rain or shine." He stepped forward. "You never told me how I know he had sickle cell, but—" She sighed and sat on the edge of the laundry table, folding her arms. "There was a donor match," she said. "We waited months for one, and we finally got the call." Damien listened, silent. "But the surgery wasn't covered. Not in full. I couldn't pay." He inhaled sharply. "I begged, Damien," she said, voice breaking for the first time. "I begged for a delay on rent. I sold jewelry, pawned his Xbox. I almost went to a loan shark." She looked away. "I was too proud to ask for help, too ashamed to admit I couldn't give my boy the one thing that could have saved him." Damien closed his eyes, and by the time I finally swallowed that pride, he was gone. The words hung in the air like fog, thick, heavy, unable to be moved. "I couldn't save him," she whispered. Damien stepped closer. "You did," he said. "You saved him every single day you chose him over your pride. You gave him love when the world gave him struggle." Clarice shook her head. "I gave him everything except a future." Damien reached into his back pocket and handed her something, a crumpled receipt from his wallet. It was the ice cream Emily had asked for the day she fainted. "I missed this," he said. "I missed my moment too." They stood there, grief pressing against both their chests, not competing, but colliding in recognition. "You're not invisible anymore, Clarice," he said. "Not to me." Later that night, Clarice sat on the porch alone. The moonlight traced soft patterns on the tile. She could hear the wind nudging the leaves, and the faint hum of crickets rising like a choir of memory. Damien joined her with 2 mugs of tea. He handed her one. "I never thanked you," he said. Clarice didn't look at him. "You don't have to." "I want to," he insisted. "Not just for Emily, but for holding this house together, for holding me together." Her throat tightened. "You don't owe me gratitude," she said. "Just honesty." He took a sip of tea. "That's harder than I thought." She finally turned to look at him. "I know." There was a long pause. Then he said, "Emily's mom, she died in front of me." Clarice froze. "We were in the car," he continued. "I made a stupid joke. She laughed. Then she stopped laughing, just like that." He exhaled shakily. "People think money prepares you for loss. It doesn't. It just gives you better flowers at the funeral." Clarice reached out slowly and placed a hand over his, and in that gesture, all the things they hadn't said found peace. A few days later, Clarice walked into Emily's room to find her asleep beneath a soft fleece blanket, a familiar one. She gasped. It was a red and blue Spider-Man blanket, faded at the edges. She turned, eyes wide. Damien stood in the doorway. "I tracked it down," he said. "You once mentioned it had a patch with a lopsided J sewn in the corner." Clarice moved to the bed and gently turned the corner. There it was, that same crooked letter, stitched by a child's hand. How did you find it? It was donated after he passed. I made a few calls, searched old thrift stores, got lucky. She held the blanket to her chest like it was air. Thank you, she whispered. Every piece of love you gave him, Damien said, now lives here too. They stood in silence as the blanket connected two children, two parents, two stories. It started with pancakes, fluffy ones, slightly burnt at the edges, just the way Emily liked them. Clarice flipped them while humming an old gospel tune. Damien set the table, clumsily pouring orange juice into 3 mismatched mugs. Emily, now stronger, sat wrapped in the Spider-Man blanket, her beanie slightly tilted. Daddy? She asked, pointing to the food. Did you really help make this? Offended, Damien replied, placing a hand on his heart. Clarice gave me strict instructions. I only messed up 2. Clarice smirked from the stove. 3. He raised his hands in mock surrender. Harsh crowd. They ate slowly, the morning sun casting a golden warmth across the dining room, something this house hadn't felt in years. Emily was still weak. Her voice cracked now and then, but her smile, that was fierce. After breakfast, she fell asleep on the couch, snuggled between them, head resting on Clarice's shoulder, tiny feet draped across Damien's lap. Neither of them moved, not because they couldn't, but because they didn't want to. That afternoon, Clarice found Damien in the garden. He was digging, actually digging, with a shovel, inexpensive loafers. She stared for a moment before asking, "Did the world end and no one told me?" Damien wiped sweat from his brow. "We're planting sunflowers. Emily said they make her feel taller." Clarice laughed. "You know they grow 10 feet high, right?" He grinned. "Then we better get started." She bent down beside him, took a handful of seeds, and together they pressed each one into the earth. The silence between them had changed. It no longer spoke of grief. Now it hummed with possibility. That night, Damien knocked on her door. Clarice opened it, slightly surprised to see him out of his usual routine. "I thought we could talk," he said. "Not about Emily, just talk." She nodded and stepped aside. They sat in the small den where she sometimes read after work. It was filled with second-hand books and quiet comfort. "You built a world in this room," he said, running a finger along a worn spine. "It feels more alive than the rest of the house." "I guess I needed somewhere to breathe," she replied. "Somewhere to remember I was more than just someone passing through." "You're not passing through anymore," he said, voice low. She met his eyes, startled. "Am I not?" she asked. He hesitated, then said, "You've been the one holding us all together. I didn't see it at first. But now, I don't know how we ever lived without you." Clarice exhaled slowly. "I'm still grieving, Damien," she whispered. "So am I." They sat in that fragile truth together, not rushing to fix it, just holding it. The following Sunday, Clarice didn't go to Jalen's grave. She sat on the porch with Emily instead, braiding string into bracelets. "You sure it's okay?" Emily asked. "Missing your visit?" Clarice smiled. "I think Jalen would be happy I stayed. He always said I was bad at making friends." Emily giggled. "You're not. You're my best one." Clarice blinked back tears. "You're mine too, sweet girl." Damien stepped out, holding 3 cups of sweet tea. "No tea for me," Emily announced. "Doctor said no caffeine." Damien handed her a pink lemonade instead. "Who said this had caffeine?" "Oh, right." She winked. Clarice laughed. That laughter, that rare, full-bodied sound, wrapped around Damien like a gift. He hadn't realized how much he needed to hear it. That evening, after Emily had gone to bed, Clarice stood at the sink, humming. Damien leaned against the counter. "You've changed this place," he said. She turned to face him. "So have you." He shook his head. "No, I've remembered it. What it could be. What I lost. What I want to build again." There was a beat of silence. Then, softly, "With you." Clarice's breath caught. She didn't answer. She didn't need to. Her eyes said enough. He reached for her hand and held it, not possessive, not demanding, just there. It started with a phone call. Damien had stepped out during Emily's routine checkup, answering a number he hadn't seen in over a year. "Damien, it's Caroline Winslow, board chair." Damien rubbed his temple. "Caroline, what can I do for you?" "I heard about your daughter. I'm so sorry. But I also heard something else. About your maid and your relationship with her." His jaw tightened. Caroline continued, voice syrupy but sharp. "There's talk. And it's not great for optics, especially with the gala next month. The Aldridge name means something." "I'm aware," he said coldly. "Then I'd advise discretion. You can help people like her, but don't confuse charity with companionship. It's messy." He didn't respond, just hung up. That evening he came home later than usual. Clarice was in the garden, watering the sunflower shoots. The moment she saw his face, she knew something was wrong. "You okay?" she asked. He hesitated too long. "Fine, just a long day." She studied him, the stiffness, the distance creeping back into his voice. "You sure?" He nodded without meeting her eyes. "Just tired." But when he walked away without kissing Emily goodnight, she knew he was retreating. The next morning, Damien avoided her altogether. Clarice stood in the kitchen, arms folded, watching the coffee brew. Her chest ached. By mid-afternoon, she found him in the office. "We should talk," she said. He didn't look up from his screen. "About what?" Her stomach dropped. "About us." He sighed. "Clarice, maybe we moved too fast." She blinked. "I don't want to complicate things," he added. "Emily's getting better. We found a rhythm." "A rhythm?" she echoed, her voice tight. "Is that what this was?" "Clarice—" "No, say it," she cut him off, her voice trembling now. "You're ashamed." "That's not fair." She took a step closer. "Then what is this? Because a week ago, you were holding my hand and telling me I changed your life." His eyes flickered. "You did," he said. "But it's not sustainable. There are optics, reputations, expectations." The words hit like stones. Clarice's breath hitched. "So I'm a liability." "Don't twist this," she let out a bitter laugh. "I'm not twisting anything. I've lived this script before. I was good enough to clean your home, to raise your child, to bleed beside you, but not good enough to stand beside you." Damien said nothing, and that silence was the loudest thing she'd ever heard. She nodded slowly, her jaw tight. "I gave you everything," she whispered, "and I let myself believe, for one moment, that someone like me could belong in a place like this." Her voice cracked. "But I was just the help, right?" Damien's face contorted, guilt rising. "Clarice, please." "No," she said, stepping back. "Don't say another word." She turned and walked out. He didn't follow. Emily noticed almost immediately. "Why didn't Miss Clarice tuck me in last night?" "She's busy," Damien lied. Emily frowned. "She always has time." When Clarice didn't show the next morning, Emily sat on her bed holding the Spider-Man blanket like a shield. "She's not coming back, is she?" she whispered. Damien knelt beside her. "She's just taking space." Emily turned away. "I liked our family better when it was broken with her than perfect without her." Clarice stood at her apartment window later that night, staring out into the dark. The silence inside her home felt deafening. No Emily's giggles, no burnt pancakes, no sunflower roots to tend. She wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and let the tears come. It was foolish to hope, foolish to believe she could be anything more than a chapter in someone else's healing. She reached into her closet and pulled out Jalen's Spider-Man blanket and held it like an apology. Meanwhile, Damien stood in his office, staring at the picture of Emily on her 5th birthday. He remembered how her mother had smiled that day, so proud, so full of grace. He wondered what she'd say now, and somewhere in the back of his heart her voice echoed, "Don't let fear cost you love twice." 3 days passed, no calls, no messages, no Clarice. The house had never felt louder in its silence. The dishes sat untouched in the sink. The sunflowers wilted, forgotten. The scent of lavender, once trailing behind Clarice like a quiet hymn, was gone. And Emily wasn't smiling anymore. She didn't ask for waffles. She didn't braid string or hum while drawing. She just sat quietly on the couch, the Spider-Man blanket wrapped tightly around her, as if she could keep Clarice nearby, wrapping herself in memory. Damien had been wrong before, but never like this. Clarice stood in the grocery store, staring blankly at the same can of tomatoes for 5 minutes. She wasn't hungry, but going home to an empty apartment felt worse than standing in a too-cold aisle surrounded by strangers. She kept replaying his words. There are optics. Maybe we moved too fast. This isn't sustainable. And the worst part, she believed him. Not because he was right, but because that lie had lived in her longer than he had. The lie that said love was a luxury people like her didn't get to keep. She placed the tomatoes back on the shelf and walked out of the store empty-handed. That evening, Damien sat on Emily's bed, watching her trace invisible shapes on the ceiling. "Want me to read to you?" he asked. She shook her head. He tried again. "We could draw, or water the sunflowers." "Miss Clarice always watered them," she said softly. "She talked to them too." "She did?" "Yeah," Emily nodded. "She said sunflowers are stubborn. They always find the sun." Damien smiled faintly. "She also said love is a choice," Emily added, "that you don't just fall into it, you decide, over and over." Damien looked at his daughter, small and bald and brilliant. "She was right," he whispered. Emily turned to him. "So what are you going to choose?" That night, Damien didn't sleep. He walked the halls. He stopped in the kitchen where she used to hum and burn toast. He sat on the porch where they'd once shared tea in silence. And finally he entered her room, the one she'd lived in, quietly, modestly, and with so much grace. He sat on the edge of her bed. Folded across the pillow was the apron she'd always worn, and beneath it, her rosary, something she must have forgotten, or maybe left on purpose. He picked it up gently. The beads were warm from memory. The next morning, Clarice stood at her bathroom mirror, tying a scarf around her head. Her scalp had started growing short curls again, but she wasn't hiding. She was remembering. Jalen, Emily, Damien. All three had changed her. All three had taught her that strength wasn't just endurance. It was being willing to try again. Even when it hurt. A knock echoed through her apartment door. Her breath caught. She opened it slowly. And there he was. Damien Aldridge, disheveled, hollow-eyed, holding the apron in one hand, the rosary in the other. "You forgot these," he said softly. Clarice swallowed. "I didn't forget." "I figured," he said. A long pause. Then he stepped inside and placed both items on her kitchen table. "I can't take back what I said," he began. "I can't undo the silence, or how I made you feel." She crossed her arms. "Then why are you here?" "Because I made a choice," he said, stepping closer. "And I chose wrong." Clarice looked at him, at this man who had once seen her only as staff, then as comfort, and now as something he could not live without. "I don't want you in my house," he added, voice cracking. "I want you in my life." Her lip trembled. "I'm not asking you to forget what I said. I'm asking you to believe what I'm saying now." He held out his hand. "I choose you." She stared at him. Her eyes brimmed. "And I'll keep choosing you," he said, "even when it's hard, even when people talk, even when I'm scared, especially then." She took one step forward, then another, and finally placed her hand in his. "I'm not perfect," she whispered. "I'm not either," he replied, "but I want to build something that is." They stood like that, in her tiny apartment kitchen, no wealth between them, just choice, and the kind of love you earn. 3 months later, the house no longer smelled like silence. It smelled like cinnamon toast and damp sunflowers, like lavender soap and crayons melted on the porch. Emily was stronger now, her immune system rebuilding, her hair growing back in soft, uneven tufts that made her giggle in the mirror. She no longer wore her beanies indoors. She didn't have to. Clarice had kept hers off too. When Emily asked why, Clarice simply said, "Because we earned these crowns." On a quiet Sunday morning, Damien stood in the kitchen, flipping pancakes. They were just slightly burnt, on purpose. Emily sat on the counter, licking syrup off her fingers. "You know, these are still not as good as Miss Clarice's," she said. Damien smirked. "She says the same about mine." At that moment, Clarice walked in, tying her apron around her waist. "You trying to poison my child?" she teased. He offered her the spatula. "Trade you for a kiss." Emily covered her eyes. "Gross." Clarice laughed and kissed him anyway. Later that day, they visited Jalen's grave together. Clarice brought his favorite marbles. Emily placed a tiny Spider-Man action figure at the headstone, and Damien stood silently, hand in Clarice's, finally part of her mourning. No longer just a witness to it. "He would have liked you," Clarice whispered. Damien smiled. "I hope so." She squeezed his hand. "He would have liked us." When they returned home, there was a small crowd gathered on the back patio. Just a few close friends, Emily's doctor, and the kind old gardener who used to sneak her cookies when no one was watching. A simple arch of sunflowers stood beneath the early evening sky. Emily stood beneath it in a blue dress, holding a pillow with 2 rings. Damien turned to Clarice. "You ready?" he asked. Clarice blinked. "You're serious?" He nodded. "Marry me. Right here. Right now. No spectacle. Just us." Her breath caught. She looked down at Emily, who grinned and whispered, "Say yes, so I can throw petals." Clarice laughed through her tears. "Yes." The small crowd clapped. Emily tossed petals with reckless joy, and under that sunflower arch, Clarice and Damien sealed their quiet love with the loudest vow. Forever. That night, Clarice tucked Emily into bed. She reached for the Spider-Man blanket, draped it gently over her. Emily yawned. "You're not going anywhere now, right?" Clarice smiled and kissed her forehead. "Not ever." Damien stood at the doorway watching them, and for the first time since his world broke apart, he felt whole. Weeks later, a letter arrived. From the Caroline woman. It read, in clipped cursive, "We understand your decision, though we strongly urge discretion in the future. Reputation is everything." Damien tossed it into the fire without blinking. He turned to Clarice. "You know what's everything?" he asked. She raised a brow. "What?" He pointed to Emily, dancing barefoot in the garden. "That." Clarice nodded. "They still talk," she said. "Let them." The sunflowers bloomed tall that summer, 10 feet, just like Clarice warned. Emily named each one after Marvel characters. Tony, Wanda, Peter, Jalen. The last one she named Daddy Clarice forever. She tied a red ribbon around it. One night, after Emily had gone to sleep, Damien and Clarice sat on the porch swing, tea in hand, the stars humming overhead. "Do you think we would have found each other without her?" he asked. Clarice shook her head. "No, but love doesn't always come the way we expect. It comes when we choose to see what's right in front of us." He leaned in. "And I see you." She smiled, rested her head against his shoulder. "I see you too."